Hello students, this is Dr. Hank and we are going to complete our Unit 5, Introduction to Ecology of Tropical Rainforests. So this is part 2. With this part 2, we are going to be focusing on biological interactions. Okay, so with part 1, we basically discussed about what is a rainforest and physical, chemical and biological characteristics of a rainforest. So with this, we are going to be focusing on interactions. So we will discuss 4 major interactions. And when you talk about ecology, biological interactions is one of the major themes. So wherever you go, you see interactions between animals and plants, and sometimes animals, and sometimes with animal and physical environment. So with these 4, we are going to be basically talking about interactions between living organisms. Okay, so every species is connected to at least one or more species throughout biological interactions. In general, one species may have connected with hundreds of other species through these interactions. And some of these interactions are positive and some are negative. For an example, look at this image. So in this picture, you can see a bee is actually obtaining its food, either nectar or pollen. It's basically collecting the food. So it's beneficial for this bee because it's going to get the food. But what about the flower? Is there any benefits? If you look carefully, you can see the entire body of this bee is covered with pollens. So once it goes to a different flower, it will actually cross-pollinate that flower with these pollens. So the plants also get some benefits, the pollination, right? So overall, the pollination-pollinator interaction is a positive interaction. Let's look at this image. So there's 4 lions and they are trying to knock down this poor buffalo. So eventually they'll kill this buffalo and eat it. So eventually these lions will get some food, so that's a positive thing. But what about this buffalo? It's going to lose the life. So if you think about predation, it's a positive interaction for the predator because it's going to get some food. But predation to prey, not so good because it's going to lose its life. And likewise, in the case of parasitism, the host will get some negative impacts, but the actual parasite is actually getting all the nutritional advantages from the host. Okay, so let's go through more examples. Before that, let's summarize these interactions using this table. So it's easy to actually remember this. So I'm listing, the first column is the interaction. The next 2 columns are just 2 imaginary species. So if you think about competition, there's 2 species interacting with each other and both parties are getting negative benefits. If you think about like the number of negative signs, so species 1 may have 1 negative sign, but species 2 may have 2 or 3. So although it's negative for both parties, the degree of negativity is different between these 2 species, and you'll realize why in a minute. Predation, it's a positive interaction for the predator, but negative for the prey item. Mutualism, it's positive like pollination. And in the parasitism, it's positive for the parasite, but it's negative for the host, just like the predation. But the players are different. So this is a nice, easy way to actually remember about these interactions. So let's start with competition. Okay, so the definition is of competition is an interaction between 2 species or individuals. Typically, they inhabit in the same habitat, and at least one party would suffer with 3 conditions: reduced growth, reproduction, and survival. So basically, it's an interaction between two organisms. It could be the same species, or it could be two different species. Generally, they are in the same habitat and they are competing for the same resource, right? And there's some costs of growth, reproduction, and survival for at least one of these interacting individuals. But we cannot say it's competition if it is not, if this interaction is not meeting these three conditions. The first one is there should be a common resource. So for an example, both of these parties should go for the same food item. If I'm going for ice cream and if you are going for chocolate, there's no competition. But if we both are going after ice cream, then there's some competition between us. And also think about an unlimited supply of ice cream. If there's no limitations of the supply, then there's no competition. Everybody will be happy. There's enough uh, for everyone. So the second condition is that particular resource has to be in limited supply. And as I mentioned before, in order to classify it as competition, at least one party should suffer significantly. Okay, so as we mentioned before, sometimes these two interacting individuals belong to the same species, sometimes not. So depending on that, we can further subdivide the competition into two major groups, interspecific competition and intraspecific competition. So interspecific competition is the competition between different species. So in this scene, you'll see there's a dead wildebeest, and also there's a bunch of hyenas and a single lion. So both the lion and these hyenas are competing for the same food. So this is a competition between two different species, and we call it interspecific competition. But in this scene, you see two bighorn sheep, in this case two males, are fighting with each other. So they are fighting for girls. And since the two interacting individuals belong to the same species, we call this intra-specific competition. So it's within the same species. And there's two major outcomes of the competition. So one outcome, and typically this is the most common outcome, is one party will actually win this competitive interaction, and typically it's the superior competitor, but the other party will lose. In other words, the superior competitor will consume the resource while the inferior competitor will lose it, or sometimes they completely extirpate from the system, and we call this competitive exclusion. The other outcome would be two or more parties can divide up the resource, and we call this resource partitioning. And there's tons of examples for this too, especially in the rainforest where there are so many species. We can actually see lots of examples for resource partitioning. Okay, so let's explore both competitive exclusion and resource partitioning with some examples. So how many of you guys have seen this? Paramecium. It's a single-celled organism. It's a protist. And as you can see, it has a body covered with cilia. And there's a little groove over here. So the action of these cilia maintain a continuous water current to this area. And it actually filter feeds on other small organisms like bacteria. And these are food vacuoles. And this is a very common one. So if you get some water from a nearby pond and observe it under microscope, you will definitely see paramecium. And you can easily culture these guys in the lab. So just taking the advantage of those characteristics of paramecium, Dr. Gose actually did some pioneering experiments on competition. So what he did was First, he had pure cultures of Paramecium. So now we are dealing with two species, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum. And if you just focus on Paramecium aurelia, so this is what happened in the pure culture, a single species culture, time of the day, and this is the number of Paramecia. So basically, he cultured it with few individuals. So he started with about 10 or 20 Paramecium aurelia and provided all the food and other resources. So as you can see, it's a classical growth curve. So the population grew rapidly and eventually reached the carrying capacity, right? And same thing happened with Paramecium caudatum. This is a second species. So he started with about 20 individuals and eventually they reached their carrying capacity. So at this point, there's no any competition between these two species because they are in two different containers, two different cultures, right? And then what he did was he actually cultured them together in the same container. So look what happened. So initially both populations started growing, right? And Paramecium aurelia kept growing and it reached the carrying capacity at around 300 individuals per 0.5 milliliter. But what happened to Paramecium caudatum? Eventually it actually went extinct. So after day 20, there were only a few Paramecium caudatum in the container, but Aurelia were doing just fine. So what is happening here? Okay, I'm gonna pose two questions to you guys. So in this case, some of the resources were actually limited. So what are those limiting factors? So limited resources. And in this case, one Paramecium species acted as a superior competitor and the other one acted like an inferior competitor. So what Paramecium species is the better competitor? So have a look and think about all the dynamics and come up with the answers for these. What are the limiting resources? Number one, and which Paramecium is the superior competitor? Okay, we are moving to a different case study. So in this case, we have some really cool birds. And all of these warblers are neotropical migrants. So they basically overwinter in Central and South America. But during the summertime, late spring, they migrate to US, North America, and they actually breed here. Robert McCarthy is actually one of the pioneering ecologists who actually developed the theory of ecology in 1950s and 60s. And he died very young, if you look at the numbers. But anyways, he actually studied the feeding behavior of these warblers, in this case 5 species. And all of these warblers are tiny birds and they are mainly feeding on insects. And the group that MacArthur studied was feeding on pine trees. So as you can see, he observed that each species is feeding exclusively on a certain area of the coniferous plants. So for an example, the Cape May warbler is feeding in the very top of the plant. Black Bayonian warbler, pretty much the same area, but black-throated green warbler is actually feeding in the middle part of the coniferous tree. Yellow-rumped warblers mainly the ground and the lower parts, and bay-breasted also have a very specific interior portion of the tree. So what is going on here? Okay, so let's see whether you can actually answer these questions, and by answering these questions, I hope that you can actually understand what's going on. Shall we give a try? So the first question is, what is the major food item? The major food item of warblers is insects. So what is the limiting factor in this case? It's foraging space, right? And we have already learned about the competitive exclusion. If the competitive exclusion is operating, what would be the outcome? That theory basically says if there's two or more interacting or competing individuals in a given system, eventually one would dominate the system by forcing others to go extinct. So in that sense, you would expect one or two species of warblers in this system. Last one, how did they partition or divide up the limited resources? So basically, they specialized on feeding in a very specific area of the coniferous tree. Through specialization, they actually minimized the competition for food and foraging space. The second outcome of competition is resource partitioning, and you guys just realize that with warblers. So it's an adaptation. It could be behavioral or morphological or physiological, and this adaptation is reducing the interspecific competition. So this is between different species, right? And they partition the limited resource to reduce the competition so both species can coexist. Now we are going to a very remote area on the planet, but there's a direct link between this place and our class. So do you recognize this place? It's highly volcanic. This is Galapagos Islands, right? And the next example that we are going to be talking about is actually from Galapagos Islands, and it's part of ECON. Okay, so you may have heard of Darwin finches, and sometimes we call them Galapagos finches. There's 13 species, and in this case, we are going to focus on two different species, medium ground finch and the small ground finch. And we are talking about three different islands. So the first island is Daphne Major, and you find only medium ground finches in this island. The second island is Los Hermanos. That's another island, second one that we are going to be talking about, and you can find only small ground finches in this island. And if you look at the bill shape of these ground finches, you may realize that they are seed eaters. So they have these conical bills, so they can actually have enough force to crack open seeds because of the shape of the bill. So if you think about the distribution of beak depth, you can see that the beak depths are widely overlapping between medium and small ground finch in these two different islands. And you can easily correlate the beak depth with the size of seeds that they eat. So if you correlate that, you can basically conclude that these two different species are feeding the same size seeds in these two different islands. Okay, so now I'm going to show you the data for a third island. This is Santa Cruz, and the only difference is you can actually see both medium and small ground finches in this island. And look what happened. And now you can see their beak depths actually changed. So when they are co-occurring with each other, so basically the beak depth of medium ground finch increased, right? So it moved this way, and the beak depth of the small ground finch decreased. And right now there's no overlap of beak depths. In other words, there's no overlap of size of the seeds that they eat. So in this case, they are not competing for seeds. And we call this phenomenon character displacement. So basically, it's the differentiation of certain characters of two species where they co-occur as a result of interspecific competition, and we have to compare it with the locations that they occur alone. So if you go back, so in Daphne major and Los Hermanos, you will find only one species and there's no competition. But in Santa Cruz, you have both species, so technically they have to compete with each other, but they avoided competition by changing their beak depth, so they can actually utilize two distinct groups of seeds, and there's no competition between them because of that. And that is character displacement. And it actually facilitates resource partitioning, and it's actually have identified as a force driving evolutionary changes. Okay, so let's see whether you guys can answer these questions based on our second case study. What is the major food item? What is the limiting factor? And again, if competitive exclusion is operating, what would be the outcome? And also finally, how did they partition or divide up the limited resources when they co-occur? Okay, so I hope that you guys can find answers for these. Okay, so let's talk a few more examples about resource partitioning in rainforests. So as I mentioned before, rainforests have so many species, so you would expect lots of competition. In this case, rainforest bats. Bats are the second largest mammal group in rainforests, about 40% of all the mammals, and they are nocturnal. So how they actually avoided competition with each other? What they did was they specialized on various food items. So we have insect-eating bats, fruit-eating bats, nectar-eating bats, pollen-eating bats, blood-eating bats, bird-eating bats. There's so many different kinds of bats, and they have very specialized feeding habits, so they can avoid competition. So basically, insect-eating bats are not going to compete with fruit-eating bats, and the fruit-eating bats are not going to compete with bird-eating bats. So they can actually minimize the competition and they all can coexist. So this is a very nice example of resource partitioning. And in this picture, you can actually see a bird-eating bat. And there's only a few species, but there are bird-eating bats. And hummingbirds are providing another fascinating example. So in rainforest, there's so many different species of heliconia flowers. And these flowers open year round, and so they actually provide a continuous source of food for these hummingbirds. And the bill size and the shape of hummingbirds are precisely adapted to utilize nectar from one or few species of heliconia. There are so many species of hummingbirds in tropics. So far there's about like 350 species worldwide, and in neotropics we can actually see about 300. And this is how they coexist. They have very specialized builds. If you remember the sword-billed hummingbird, that's an extreme adaptation. So the curvature and the length of the bill is precisely matching with the shape of the tubular flowers of these heliconia plants. So this actually promotes the extreme diversity of hummingbirds. So each species is utilizing nectar from a very specific heliconia flower. So they don't interact with each other, they don't compete with each other. And in some extreme cases, males and females are also dividing up the resources. In this case, the purple-throated Carib hummingbirds from Caribbean, uh, you can see there's distinct morphology of beaks between males and females. The females have relatively longer and more curved beaks, and they are specializing on this red heliconia species. But males, they have a relatively shorter and somewhat straighter bill, and they are specializing on this yellow heliconia. This is one of the latest findings. Isn't it cool? Males and females are also trying to minimize the competition. So overall, specialization actually promotes speciation. So when the resources are limited, but at the same time there are so many individuals, you all can coexist if you specialize on one group of the resource. And this specialization eventually leads to speciation. And we discussed about this with Madagascan vengas. Do you remember that example? And also Hawaiian honeycreepers. So therefore, competition acts as a direct force to create more species, right? So, and we call this process adaptive radiation. So examples are Hawaiian honeycreepers, Darwin finches, as we mentioned, and also great African lake cichlids. Okay, so to better understand how specialization actually leads to speciation or the creation of new species, we are going to be doing a virtual lab on lizard evolution. You guys have already watched this video, and you can actually watch it again, and you can actually find more information about this lab under lab number 1. So there's some tutorials on how to do the measurements and how to count toe pads, things like that, and you are going to be collecting some data, and you'll analyze your data, and you'll, by the end of this lab, you will have a really good understanding of how specialization leads to speciation. Okay, so our next topic is predation. So in this interaction, one species is actually using another species as food. And if you think about any living organism, it's either a predator or prey. And in this case, you can see this grizzly bear is actually eating a salmon. So this is the predator and this is the prey. And in this case, the same thing is happening, but it's a little bit different. So herbivory is a special case of predation. The predator is the herbivore, and the prey is either plant or plant parts. Okay, so let's go back to the same lab. This is Dr. Ghosh's lab, and you may remember that it's the same person who did experiments with paramecium. In this case, he did more experiments with mites. So he wanted to study the population dynamics between a prey and a predator species of mites. So he started with probably about 50 prey species, 50 individuals of the prey mite, and about 40 individuals of the predator mite. So initially, prey population increased without any trouble, right? And when the prey population is increasing, it'll actually provide lots of food for this predator population, right? So they can eat and reproduce, so they can increase too. But as the predator population is increasing, that can actually have a negative impact on the prey, because more predators will eat more prey, and now you can see the prey population is crashing and the predator population is still increasing. Eventually, the prey population went extinct. When there's no prey, the, the predator population will eventually collapse. But do you actually see this in nature? So let's try to get answers for these questions. So what is the most abundant species in day 10? Right here, it's prey. What is the most abundant species in day 40? It's actually the predator. What is the ultimate fate of prey? It actually went extinction. What is the ultimate fate of predator? The same fate. Both populations vanished. But we really don't see this in nature, right? If it is the case, we shouldn't see this many species. So there's some sort of balance between predators and prey, and we call them population cycles. And ecologists actually describe them as boom-bust cycles. It's a complex phenomenon, and let's try to understand it by looking at this example. So they've been actually studying the predator-prey interactions between Canada lynx and snowshoe hare from mid-1800s. So we have a really good data set. And this graph actually summarizes the population sizes of both species. The x-axis is the time, and the y-axis is population in thousands. And the red is snowshoe hare, and the blue is lynx. So the first thing that you realize is typically predator populations are smaller than the prey populations, right? And also you'll see that there's like boom-bust cycles. So a rapid increase of the population and immediately a rapid decline of the population. And these boom and bust cycles are happening for both prey and the predator. So let's try to focus on, let's start from 1855. So let's see what's going to happen. So lynx, they actually eat snowshoe hares. When there's more snowshoe hares, the lynx have more food, so they can actually reproduce more and increase their population cycle. So when there's more lynx, less snowshoe hares, but when there's less lynx, snowshoe hares can actually increase their population. So let's see whether we can actually see that here. So initially, let's start from here. So very few lynx, right? And you can see when there's low number of lynx or the predator, the population size of snowshoe hares is actually increasing dramatically because of less predation. But at the same time, this increasing population of snowshoe hares are actually making a really nice prey base for lynx. So when there's more food, now lynx are actually increasing their population size too. But at a certain point right here, do you see that the snowshoe hare population is crashing rapidly, because now there's too many lynx preying upon snowshoe hares and they cannot sustain their population. So the snowshoe hare population just crashed. When there's no prey, then the lynx cannot survive, so they crash too. So, and again, now we have very few lynx in the population, and now the snowshoe hares can actually start over. And this is happening since 1855, and this is not the only system, and the same thing is happening in every predator-prey populations. And this is one of those very rare data sets. And okay, so I have a question. So who do you think that collected this data in 1855? The classical ecology uh, was not developed until like early 1900s. So there were no ecologists until early 1900s. So who collected this data? Hunters collected this data. So they actually killed both snowshoe hares and lynx for their pelt, and they have really good records of number of pelts. And that's how ecologists actually regenerated this uh, hare lynx population cycle. Okay, so when you think about a predator and a prey, so the prey is always trying to evade from the predator. So it's a continuous battle, right? And at the same time, the predator is trying to come up with effective ways to locate, capture, and kill the prey item. So this is a never-ending battle. So prey is always trying to come up with new adaptations to evade from predators, and the predator is always trying to come up with new adaptations to capture and kill prey. And we call this coevolution of predator-prey interactions. So basically, two interacting species act as a selective force on each other. So if you look at this image, so we have two species, species 1 and species 2. Uh, so species 1, let's say this is our prey. It's going to come up with the new adaptations to evade from the uh, predator. And that will select the species 2, our predator, to come up with another new adaptation to better locate the prey item. And again, this is a never-ending game, and we call these evolutionary arms races. Okay, so do you recognize this one? This is a frog-eating bat from tropics. So there are some challenges for predators and also for prey. So let's spend some time on challenges of predators. So there are three major categories of challenges facing a predator. The first one is prey detection. So they have to detect the prey. And for the most part, most species are using vision, and many are using olfaction, and some specialized ones are actually using sound or even echolocation. So when we are out in the Amazon, we may actually see pink river dolphin, and if you look carefully about his head, you see this hump. So this is where the echolocation related organs are developed. So it's actually echolocating to find prey items in murky waters, because you can see, you cannot really use the olfaction effectively in an aquatic medium. So it's actually very effective to use the echolocation. And other dolphins are using it, and also bats are using echolocation. So once you detect the prey, then you have to capture it and subdue it. So there are several ways to do it. So some species are ambush predators. So they just wait for a long time, like this boa constrictor, and once it detects a passing potential prey, it just strikes. But others, like pink river dolphins, they actively look for predators, so they actually move a lot compared to these guys. And hunting strategy is also different between predators. Some are solitary, like these boa constrictors. Some are doing group hunting, like some of the river dolphins. And also in some cases, we have noticed that cooperative hunting among wolves and some lions. So they have plans, and they use plans to knock down large prey. And also, prey animals have adaptations to avoid predation. One is the crypticity. So basically, it's a mechanism to avoid detection by predators. There are several ways that you can hide yourself. First one is color matching, and we call it camouflage. Do you see the sloth? So it has some algae growing on the hair, so it's greenish. So it perfectly matches with the background greenery. And sometimes it's easy to actually break up the outline. Think about all the stripes of many organisms and spots. So that will effectively break up the outline of the organism. So when you cannot detect the outline, it's really hard to target. So the predator will be confused. And counter shading is another popular mechanism to hide. So look at this fish. Not only this one, in most fish, they have dark uh, upper parts and light lower parts. What is going on here? So think about a predator attacking from the above, and this dark color will actually blend in really well with the darker bottom of the habitat. And if another predator is actually trying to attack it from the bottom, then these light colors will perfectly blend with uh, the very bright skies. So the predator is going to have a hard time locating this animal. And most predators are actually targeting the eye, because typically the eye is very close to the head. So if you strike the head, you can knock down your prey really easily. So if you hide the eye, like this case, the predator will be confused. And sometimes some animals like these wildebeest, they have large herds, and when there are so many individuals moving here and there, it's really hard for a predator to target one individual. And also most of the prey items can run fast, so they have mechanisms to evade predation, like in this antelope. And also some have toxins, like in this poison dart frog. So they basically say, don't eat me. If you eat me, you'll be dead. So they have these warning colors, very bright reds, oranges, and yellows. And then predators have learned that if you eat this, it's going to be either very distasteful or you will be dead. And also, we discussed that herbivory is a kind of a predation. So plants or the prey animals, they also have some responses to avoid herbivores. Some structural defenses like thorns and spines, so they basically evade the predators. And when we are actually in the field, we may see that most of the palm trees in tropics, they have spines. And also some have higher content of lignin, cellulose, and silica. So this is not palatable. So typically when there's high concentrations of lignin, cellulose, and silica, uh, the herbivores tend to actually avoid those particular plants. And also they also have chemicals like poison dart frogs, and we call these secondary compounds, and it makes the plant either toxic or unpalatable. So typically when there's high concentration of these secondary compounds, the herbivores are they tend to actually avoid these plants. So with that, we'll start mutualism. This is our third interaction. So there's two major groups of mutualistic interactions. In some cases, it is not necessary for either species who are involved in this relationship, and we call them facultative mutualism. For an example, cowbirds and bison. So typically these cowbirds are picking on the insects on the bison. So the cowbirds will get food, and the parasite load of the bison will be reduced. But what's going to happen if these cowbirds are not present in that particular habitat? Do you think that these bison can still survive? Yes, they can still survive. But the other extreme would be the obligate mutualism, and neither species cannot survive without each other. So in this case, yucca plant and the yucca moth. So yucca moths actually is the only agent which pollinates these yucca plants, But at the same time, these yucca moths are laying their eggs on the yucca plants, and that's the only host. So they both have to have each other for the existence of both species. Basically, they cannot live without each other, and that's obligate mutualism. And if you think about us, there's so many bacteria in our gut, more than 500 species, and there's more bacteria than the number of cells in our body. And most of them are actually mutualistic bacteria, so they help with digestion, some even prevent growth of harmful bacteria, and in some cases they produce hormones and vitamins. So we are providing a nice and cozy place for these bacteria to stay, and we are providing all the food, but as uh, a, uh, but as a service for that, they're actually providing all these benefits to us. And also, some mutualistic interactions are based on nutritional exchanges, and we call that nutrition mutualism. So, two species may exchange nutrients, or one species may reward another species for providing nutritional benefits. So, one example would be plant mycorrhizae. This is an association between plant roots and fungi, and this is a very common association in rainforests. So basically, the fungi associated with these roots, they increase the surface area of the root system functionally, and also uh, and physically. So the fungus will get all the food from the plant, and the plant actually get essential elements absorbed through these fungus partners. And also lichens. Lichens is an association between algae and fungus. So the fungus get all the food from the algae, because algae is an autotroph. They can generate their own food, but at the same time, without the fungus, the algae cannot actually live. The home for algae is provided by the fungus. So algae get a place to live, and also all the carbon dioxide, so they can make food and share it with the fungus. Another category of mutualism is protection mutualism. So basically, one species provide a benefit to another that provides protection from predators, herbivores, or parasites. One classical example from the rainforest is ant Cecropia mutualism. We discussed about this plant even before. Cecropia species are widespread in rainforest, and this is a successional species, right? So if you go to a forest gap, you can easily find these plants, and if you find one of these plants, have a closer look. You may find lots of insects, actually ants. So basically, the Cecropia provides housing and also nectar for these ants. Do you see these swollen areas at leaf bases? So actually, ants live inside of these, and also they have something called extrafoliar nectaries. So these are nectar producing glands outside of flowers. So ants actually get food and place to live, but what is the benefit for the plant? So ants, they can sting, right? So, and also they can actually feed on other potential parasites on this plant. So essentially, the plant actually gets some benefits uh, from these ants, so they can actually avoid potential parasites and herbivores. Another example for mutualism would be transportation mutualism. So in this case, a mobile species like this bird, it's a toucan, and also another mobile species, it's a spider monkey. They are rewarded for moving gametes. So gametes are things like seeds or individuals of a sessile species. Sessile species is a species that cannot move like plants. So essentially, plants are making flowers and fruits for these animals. So actually, the animals can actually help plants by moving these. So seed dispersal is a classical example for transportation mutualism. In this case, you can see this spider monkey is actually feeding on some palm nuts, and then they can actually disperse the seeds when they defecate. And in this case, you can see this papaya. This toucan is feeding on the papaya, and again, when they are going to another place, they can actually defecate and spread the seeds of this papaya tree. With that, we are going to touch on our last interaction, parasitism. So again, this is an interaction between two species, and one species will get benefits, other will get some negative benefits, right? So the parasite will get benefits, and the host species will lose. So some parasites actually kill the host, but some do not. But either way, the host will suffer some reduced survival and reduced reproduction. And we may have discussed this very briefly. Parasitism actually promotes species diversity in tropical areas, and we briefly discussed about cordyceps fungi. And let's watch this video to actually understand how the parasitism is actually promoting species diversity in a rainforest.
Incredibly, 80% of all insects live in jungles. Few are more successful than the ants. There can be 8 million individuals in a single hectare. But jungle ants don't have it all their own way. These bullet ants are showing some worrying symptoms. Spores from a parasitic fungus called cordyceps have infiltrated their bodies and their minds. Its infected brain directs this ant upwards. Then, utterly disorientated, it grips a stem with its mandibles. Those afflicted that are discovered by the workers are quickly taken away and dumped far away from the colony. It seems extreme, but this is the reason why. Like something out of science fiction, the fruiting body of the cordyceps erupts from the ant's head. It can take 3 weeks to grow, and when finished, the deadly spores will burst from its tip. Then any ant in the vicinity will be in serious risk of death. The fungus is so virulent it can wipe out whole colonies of ants. And it's not just ants that fall victim to this killer. There are literally thousands of different types of cordyceps fungi, and remarkably, each specializes on just one species. But these attacks do have a positive effect on the jungle's diversity, since parasites like these stop any one group of animal getting the upper hand. The more numerous a species becomes, the more likely it will be attacked by its nemesis, a cordyceps fungus.